All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. I know it's been a while. Obviously, coronavirus has had a lot of effects on people. I don't really want to say anything other than that because that's not what we're talking about. Um, and yeah, of course, we're gonna finally do part 4 of our series on pragmatism and Richard Rorty. So we've got, of course, Chief Keefe, aka Tim Keefe, back here, and I believe Shane Kennedy will also be joining at some point. And we're going to discuss Richard Rorty's thoughts in his book called Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. So, do you want to give a bit of an introduction there, Tim, as you usually do, and maybe a bit of a recap too, because it's been a while.
Yeah, I was thinking of that too. Okay, so we have been covering Richard Rorty, who unquestionably is probably the most important American philosopher of the late 20th century and the most important pragmatist philosopher of the late 20th century. So, just to give a recap about pragmatism, there is a triad involved: Charles Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. And so we covered in the first episode what pragmatism is. We won't really go into the nitty gritties about that. But yeah, so pragmatism is something that is kind of homegrown to the U.S., definitely in the New England part, because Peirce, James, and Dewey all themselves were New Englanders, and it was centered around Harvard. So a really good book to read about this is Louis Menon's book on the Metaphysical Club. That's a nice little piece of intellectual history if anybody's interested in seeing what the background of that was, and some of the other players besides Peirce and James in particular. But then pragmatism fell out of favor, going into the World War II, and then slightly afterwards, because there was the great influx of the analytic philosophers coming over from Europe, exiles, such as Rudolf Carnap, who took up residence at the University of Chicago, Hans Reichenbach, who was a logical positivist, and I think he was at the University of California. And so these are some of the more important analytic philosophers, early analytic philosophers of the 20th century, particularly in the States. So Rorty came on the scene. He was originally trained in sort of, let's see, trying to remember here. He got his PhD from Yale. He wrote on Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, whom we've covered in other podcasts. And he came from something of a more intellectual background, particularly as regards philosophy. But when he went to Wellesley College and then Princeton later on, where he spent a number of years, he had to kind of get with the program as far as philosophy was concerned. And Princeton at the time was a very heavily analytical program. So this is where you started to focus on things like philosophy of language and logic and mathematics and things like that. But then eventually he became disillusioned when he started to get into pragmatism. So he already was starting to get into pragmatism when he was at Princeton. But then he left and he went to the University of Virginia, where he was for a number of years too. Not in the philosophy department, by the way. He was in the Department of Humanities. And then he really made a splash with his first major book, which is entitled Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, where he was criticizing two main prongs that he saw in the history of Western philosophy in particular, one of which was epistemology, a very strong focus on epistemological concerns, which kind of stem from Descartes too, and representation. So that's where the latter part of the title comes in, Mirror of Nature. The mind is a mirror that reflects what is in nature, what is in the outside world. And so he was putting forth a criticism of the representationalist method, which is still a topic today. There are some philosophers who are representationalists, particularly with philosophy of mind, and there are other philosophers who are not representationalists. Okay. So that debate is still raging on today. So that was Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. And then he published a collection of essays that we've covered last time titled Consequences of Pragmatism, 1972 to 1980, a series of articles that he put out in different journals. where he was fleshing out his explorations of pragmatism. And this is where I believe at the time they started to consider him as a neo-pragmatist, not a pragmatist in the vein of Peirce, James, and Dewey, but resurrecting sort of pragmatism in light of what was going on with analytic philosophy at the time in the 50s, 60s, and then going into the 70s. So that's a really good collection to look at. Now, this time around, we're going to be focusing on, I'd say, probably one of his probably his singular text where he is starting to not concentrate so much on being a commentator on pragmatism as he did in Consequences of Pragmatism, but then coming up with his own take on things, his own approach to philosophy, or maybe anti-philosophy, as some people want to describe it. And that's Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, which is another collection of essays that came out in the mid-'80s.
Right.
Okay. Is that good enough for you?
Yep. Sir, my friend Sergio said when you mentioned Descartes, cogito ergo sum,
Yes.
is nice, and his famous I think therefore I am.
Yep. I think therefore I am.
Yeah.
Okay. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into the book. Okay, so before we do that, let's go ahead and take a look at each of the three terms. So, Andrew, what is contingency? Can you define that?
I would say like the idea that things are content dependent or context dependent, rather, that things are contingent upon certain circumstances and factors. So we could talk about that like in terms of truth, for example. The truth is contingent upon certain factors such as what topic you're discussing, the moment in history, the language that you're using to describe it. It might be different in a different language or even in a different place of time, your upbringing in your particular culture, and many other factors.
Right. The basic definition is contingency is the opposite of necessity.
Right.
Necessity is something must be. Contingency is it could be. So
right.
You fleshed it out a little better, and this is the same kind of thing that Rorty touches on, where in particular the first part of the book where he focuses on contingency is about language, selfhood, and community. So it's not necessary that these things are, but they are contingent upon other things. That's what contingency is. Now, how would you define irony?
Sorry, I had to finish my bong hit.
The bong of eminence.
Irony.
Yes, how would you define irony?
That would be something that's like funny in like kind of a contradictory way. Like, I don't know. I know what it means, but I guess I don't often explore.
Well, I would say that a lot of people think they know what irony means, because it's one of those they can point it out when they see it, maybe, but they can't really define it. So let me go ahead and read what Wikipedia has to say about it, because irony in itself is a very broad term. So Wikipedia says, irony in its broadest sense, as a rhetorical device, literary technique, or event in which what appears on the surface to be the case differs radically from what is actually the case. And irony can be categorized into different types, including verbal irony, dramatic irony, and situational irony. Verbal, dramatic, and situational irony are often used for emphasis in the assertion of truth. The ironic form of simile, used in sarcasm, and some forms of litetes, can emphasize one's meaning by the deliberate use of language, which states the opposite of the truth, denies the contrary of the truth, or drastically and obviously understates a factual connection. Okay. So a litetes is a rhetorical figure of speech in a form of verbal irony, which understatement is used to emphasize a point by stating a negative to further affirm a positive, often incorporating double negatives for effect. So it's a form of understatement, is what it is. Okay. Now, this is a more technical definition of what irony is. Usually when people think of irony, they think of something, like, for example, Gen Xers, my generation, we were tarred back in the 90s as the generation of irony, because there were a lot of things that were kind of opposite happening to us. I mean, I also reference Alanis Morissette's, one of your countrymen's songs, the ironic song. Isn't it ironic?
Yeah.
Where she says, it's like rain on your wedding day. It's a free ride when you've already paid. Okay, so she's mentioning some opposites there. But that's only a small part of what irony is. Rhetorically speaking, irony has a much broader base to this. But that's a good definition to start with irony. Okay.
Sergio used this example, a fire truck on
fire. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. All right, and the last one is, how would you define solidarity?
I would say, like, having a sense of loyalty and shared interests and values with a group of your peers or friends.
Mm-hmm.
If you like are people in a similar group within the same culture who have that sense of loyalty towards each other, like I don't know, like people on a sports team or people at a particular church, for example.
Right. Yeah, one way to define it, again, looking at Wikipedia, is it's an awareness of shared interests, objectives, standards, and sympathies, creating a psychological sense of unity of groups or classes. It refers to the ties in a society that bind people together as one. Okay.
Right.
So yeah, you're right. When they talk about solidarity, they talk of a sense of solidarity. Okay. Now, solidarity is a term. It's a shared sense. It's not like a tribe. I would not say it's a tribe. Okay. Even though one could say that there are certain qualities of solidarity that are exhibited in a tribe. But a tribe is something that's a little bit more restrictive, I say, because of kinship and bloodlines and things like that. Solidarity, you don't need to have bloodlines. It's just that sense of, you talk about a sports team. That's a sense of solidarity. Or a labor union, for example. That's definitely a sense of solidarity. In fact, I was alive at the time, way back in the early 80s, a significant political movement that happened in Poland was what was called Solidarity, which was a collection of dock workers, labor unions in opposition to the communist government at the time. That was a big newsworthy thing. Lech Walesa was the guy's name.
Oh, okay.
So it was called Solidarity.
Oh, I didn't know that. I bet our friend Polish Christian Bale knows that, of course.
I'm sure he does. Okay, so that's contingency, irony, and solidarity, the definitions of the terms. So in the book, Rorty is going to take each one of these and unpack them. So let's go ahead to the book itself. This is Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity by Cambridge University Press, published. But the essays themselves stretch back to, I'd say, the early 80s. Okay. So let's go ahead and get lined up here.
I had a philosophy class, basically podcast form today.
Okay.
That's what they're doing now that we can't go to our actual school.
That's smart. Yeah. You already practiced on that.
Yep.
We're not in this here. I really wanted to read through a lot of the introduction because I think that's a really value in the book itself. So if you go to page XII, which is 13 in the beginning. Excuse me a minute.
Yeah. And for people watching this, if you want to follow along, I'm pretty sure you can find a free PDF of that book, Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, online.
Yes. Okay. the introduction, I'll go ahead and begin. The use of it lies behind the attempt to answer the question, is it in one's interests to be just? And Christianity's claim that perfect self to us, psychological attempts to unite a striving for perfection with a sense of community require us to acknowledge a common human nature. They ask us to believe that what is most important to each of us is what we have in common with others, that the springs of private fulfillment and of human solidarity are the same. Skeptics like Nietzsche have urged that metaphysics and theology are transparent attempts to make altruism look more reasonable than it is. Yet such skeptics typically have their own theories of human nature. They too claim that there is something common to all human beings. For example, the will to power or libidinal impulses. Their point is that at the, quote, deepest level of the self, there is no sense of human solidarity, that this sense is a mere artifact of human socialization. So such skeptics become antisocial. They turn their backs on the very idea of a community larger than a tiny circle of initiates. Okay. Continuing, he says, ever since Hegel, however, historicist thinkers have tried to get beyond this familiar standoff. They have denied that there is such a thing as human nature, or the deepest level of the self. Their strategy has been to insist that socialization, and thus historical circumstance, goes all the way down, that there is nothing beneath socialization or prior to history which is definitory of the human. Such writers tell us that the question, what is it to be a human being, should be replaced by questions like, what is it to inhabit a rich 20th century democratic society? And how can an inhabitant of such a society be more than the enactor of a role in a previously written script? This historicist turn has helped free us, gradually but steadily, from theology and metaphysics, from the temptation to look for an escape from time and chance. It has helped us substitute freedom for truth as the goal of thinking and of social progress. But even after this substitution takes place, the old tension between the private and the public remains. Historicists in whom the desire for self-creation, for private autonomy, dominates, for example, Heidegger and Foucault, still tend to see socialization as Nietzsche did. A post-metaphysical culture seems to me no more impossible than a post-religious one, and equally desirable. Continuing, in my utopia, human solidarity would be seen not as a fact to be recognized by clearing away, quote, prejudice, or burrowing down to previously hidden depths, but rather as a goal to be achieved. It is to be achieved not by inquiry, but by imagination. The imaginative ability to see strange people as fellow sufferers. Solidarity is not discovered by reflection, but created. It is created by increasing our sensitivity to the particular details of the pain and humiliation of other, unfamiliar sorts of people. Such increased sensitivity makes it more difficult to marginalize people different from ourselves by thinking, they do not feel it as we would, or there must always be suffering, so why not let them suffer? This process of coming to see other human beings as one of us, rather than as them, is a matter of detailed description of what unfamiliar people are like, and of redescription of what we ourselves are like. This is a task not for theory, but for genres such as ethnography, the journalist's report, the comic book, the docudrama, and especially the novel. Fiction like that of Dickens, Olive Schreiner, or Richard Wright gives us the details about kinds of suffering being endured by people to whom we had previously not attended. Fiction like that of Chodorlos de Laclos, Henry James, or Nabokov give us the details about what sorts of cruelty we ourselves are capable of, and thereby lets us redescribe ourselves. That is why the novel, the movie, and the TV program have, gradually but steadily, replaced the sermon and the treatise as the principal vehicles of moral change and of progress. Okay, let's stop there for a minute.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I like what he said there about TV and so on replacing replacing sort of religious roles. It sort of reminds me of like the postmodern era for one thing, and also like what Nietzsche talks about what happens after the death of God. And I also just I think if Shane were here, he would be he would be skeptical of escaping metaphysics and the goal of a post metaphysical and post religious society. Although I like that about Rorty. I didn't remember that from reading the introduction. Actually, that's interesting. Just due to my atheist biases, mostly, I would say. Although I totally understand that we don't need to necessarily escape religion because it works really well for some people. But I like the idea of escaping metaphysics, although I understand arguments against that too.
Right. Well, we talked about metaphysics before. I personally don't think one can escape from metaphysics, but you can define metaphysics in many different ways. Now, again, whenever we read a text, we're reading what the philosopher had to say at the time. So this came out in 1989, and so Rorty, this is beyond the previous work, Consequences of Pragmatism. This is really where he's starting to flesh out what he is trying to accomplish. Now, later on, in the later collection of essays, he would substitute philosophy for things like social hope and cultural politics. Okay. But already here, you're seeing that he's continuing his project that he began in Philosophy of the Mirror of Nature, getting away from the epistemological focus on things, getting away from representationalist type of things. The mind is the mirror of nature, and then trying to not really destruct or blow up metaphysics, but saying we don't need to deal with it anymore. It's not really that important. Why? It's because this is what philosophers have been preoccupied with for centuries, is that we have to get things right. We have to find out what the truth, capital T, is. We have to find out what the right metaphysics is, because the metaphysics is going to provide us with the absolute foundations of what a good society is going to look like. Plato's Republic, John Locke's Treatise on Government, take your pick, in the history of Western philosophy in particular. So he's moving away from this. Now his, as you mentioned, is that with the TV show, the docudrama, the novel, and things like that, this is a way, and as a matter of fact, I was reading a book earlier today about the guy, I think he's a literature professor, and this is a book that came out about 10 years ago, talking about narratives and useful fictions, and that there's an evolutionary basis behind this. Okay. So narratives, stories, we are a narrative creating animal, and that we operate by narratives. Philosophy itself could be a narrative. Okay. An explanation of how things work, how things all hang together in the broadest possible sense. And I think that's a definition that Rorty gave. So yes, with the novel, and people have, other people have said too, is that if you grew up reading novels, you really get a sense of what the interior life of another person is versus reading a biography, because a biography is by somebody that is at a distance, going over facts of the person's life. But when you read about a character, and of course we know the character is fictitious, when you create a character in a novel, if you do things like that, writing novellas or long form novels, is that you have to come up with dialogue and you have to come up with character development. What's going on within the mind of the character, things like that. So the more novels you read, the more types of those kind of stories you read, the more that you are armed with, and this is an important term for Rorty, is redescriptions, descriptions of things, and then redescribing things and redescribing things and redescribing things, instead of being stuck in only one description, and this applies in the broadest possible sense to everybody. Okay, which is in his estimation, in a roundabout way, is what metaphysics is trying to do, getting at the very nitty gritty. And what he mentioned before about with Nietzsche is that, if you were Nietzschean, the criticism is that there's nothing there when you get down to brass tacks. Then the historicist thinkers, which came on board, is that everything is based upon, as you said in the beginning, contingent upon a certain historical pattern. How people in the 19th century are different from what they are in the 21st century, then they're different from the 15th century. All that is based on whatever the historical milieu is. Okay, that's
Right.
another way of looking at things.
Okay. So the idea is that metaphysics was evolved because it's a useful way of telling ourselves stories about how the way the world works, and you can have different forms of metaphysics that change across history and across cultures.
Yeah. Yes. Same thing
Okay.
with theology. Theology itself could be another narrative.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
All right. So pressing on, next paragraph. Rorty has to say, in my liberal utopia, this replacement would receive a kind of recognition which it so lacks. That recognition would be part of a general turn against theory and toward narrative. Against theory and toward narrative. Such a turn would be emblematic of our having given up the attempt to hold all the sides of our life in a single vision, to describe them with a single vocabulary. It would amount to a recognition of what, in Chapter 1, I call the contingency of language, the fact that there is no way to step outside the various vocabularies we have employed and find a meta-vocabulary which somehow takes account of all possible vocabularies, all possible ways of judging and feeling. A historicist and nominalist culture of the sort I envisage would settle instead for narratives which connect the present with the past, on the one hand, and with utopian futures on the other. More important, it would regard the realization of utopias and the envisaging of still further utopias as an endless process, an endless proliferating realization of freedom, rather than a convergence toward an already existing truth.
Oh, interesting. So
Okay.
it's like a it's like a story that is always changing instead of a theory that is static and unchanging.
Right, and that's what the metaphysician attempts to do with a theory. I am the philosopher. Here is my metaphysical theory. It encompasses everything, all possible vocabularies, another key term in Rorty too, that will describe everything. Okay, and it's unchanging. It's fixed. And because of that, with this armature that we now have, we can get to what the truth is. And this is how we order society.
Okay.
Okay, so Rorty is doing away with all this. So language, the vocabularies are contingent. There is no final meta vocabulary, no final vocabulary, but instead an endless vocabulary. And he purposely uses the term utopia, and we all know what a utopia is. Doesn't exist.
Right.
So this is somewhat of a theory that he's describing. In my liberal utopia, he says, this is how things would be. All right.
Right.
So continuing to the next page. Oh, wait. Oh, no. Are these out of order? I think they are.
Which?
I'm looking at the pages. They might be out of order. Okay, there we go. Hold on a sec.
Okay.
These pages appear to be out of order.
That's weird.
Yeah, it is. Let me go ahead and do this page. I'm skipping a couple paragraphs here. All right,
Oh, hey, Shane's here.
Hello, Shane.
Hey, Shane, how you doing?
Doing good. How are you guys?
We just
good.
talked about an interesting subject that I thought you would object to because Rorty is talking about escaping metaphysics and the idea of living in a post-metaphysical and post-religious society.
Mm-hmm. What section are we in of the three?
We're
in the first one?
We're in contingency in the introduction.
Yes, I'm
What
doing the
page are we on,
introduction.
Tim?
I'm doing the introduction to the book. So this is page 14, the small Roman numerals.
Okay. Well, I don't have the book in front of me, but I did read the introduction and the contingency section. I just didn't get to the second one.
Okay.
Okay.
So I thought it was a good idea for us to just go through the introduction because it has a nice tidy summary of what else is in the book.
Cool.
And we're not
Cool.
going to be able to cover the entire book in one podcast, so we're gonna see how it goes.
That sounds good to me.
All
Just
right.
as a side note before we begin, I've tried to play the Tim role now a little tiny bit with a couple things, and I'm like, oh my god, this is so much harder than I ever thought. So I have yet another reason to appreciate.
Yes,
Keefe
I
and
got a
Shane.
lot. I
So,
got a lot more practice on you there, Shane.
yes, this is
You
true.
just have
Okay,
to
without
grow.
that,
You have to grow into the role over time.
yes, one day I can be Shane or something,
There you go.
There you go.
All right, so we're on page XIV 14 in the lower Roman numerals. So I'm kind of skipping around here because apparently the pages are out of order, but I'm just resuming
Okay.
where I can. Okay, so Rorty says, there is no way in which philosophy or any other theoretical discipline will ever let us do that. The closest we will come to joining these two quests is to see the aim of a just and free society as letting its citizens be as privatistic, quote, irrationalist, and aestheticist as they please, so long as they do it on their own time, causing no harm to others and using no resources needed by those less advantaged. There are practical measures to be taken to accomplish this practical goal, but there is no way to bring self-creation together with justice at the level of theory. The vocabulary of self-creation is necessarily private, unshared, unsuited to argument. The vocabulary of justice is necessarily public and shared, a medium for argumentative exchange. He continues. If we could bring ourselves to accept the fact that no theory about the nature of man or society or rationality or anything else is going to synthesize Nietzsche with Marx or Heidegger with Habermas, we could begin to think of the relation between writers on autonomy and writers on justice as being like the relation between two kinds of tools, as little in need of synthesis as are paintbrushes and crowbars. One sort of writer lets us realize that the social virtues are not the only virtues, that some people have actually succeeded in recreating themselves. We thereby become aware of our own half-articulate need to become a new person, one whom we as yet lack words to describe. The other sort reminds us of the failure of our institutions and practices to live up to the convictions to which we are already committed by the public, shared vocabulary we use in daily life. The one tells us that we need not speak only of the language of the tribe, that we may find our own words, that we may have a responsibility to others to find them. The other tells us that responsibility is not the only one we have. Both are right, but there is no way to make both speak a single language. This book tries to show how things look if we drop the demand for a theory which unifies the public and private, and are content to treat the demands of self-creation and of human solidarity as equally valid, yet forever incommensurable. It sketches a figure whom I call the, quote, liberal ironist. I borrow my definition of liberal from Judith Shklar, who says that liberals are the people who think that cruelty is the worst thing we do. I use ironist to name the sort of person who faces up to the contingency of his or her own most central beliefs and desires, someone sufficiently historicist and nominalist to have abandoned the idea that those central beliefs and desires refer back to something beyond the reach of time and chance. Liberal ironists are people who include among those ungroundable desires their own hope that suffering will be diminished, that the humiliation of human beings by other human beings may cease. Okay, let's stop there for a minute.
Okay.
So let's look at his definition of liberal. So Judith Shklar, by the way, was a Harvard professor writing on topics like justice, and I've seen her books, but I can't remember what the titles are. But again, this is in the late 80s. Who says that liberals are those people who think that cruelty is the worst sort of thing we do. Okay. Now, given all the turmoil that has emerged in the past 10 years or so, can we say that those people who describe themselves as liberal would believe in this, that cruelty is the worst thing we do?
I don't know. It kind of seems that way, I guess. I don't know.
Okay. Shane, what do you think?
I would say no. And I would say this kind of raises the question that I wanted to ask before yours, which is where he's grounding these goals or these definitions in the sense that, like, if he's going to state that this thing he's putting forward is going to appeal to this particular label, where does he derive that label? And the reason that question is relevant is for this exact reason you brought up, which is how static is even that label, right?
That's like part of what he was claiming earlier, that like that these are stories that continuously change based on the contingent factors, like how cultures and language change, rather than like a static theory that's set in stone.
Right. Later on, Shane, what he gets to is his figure is the liberal ironist. Okay, that's what he described himself as, and the main figure that is running throughout contingency, irony, and solidarity, as opposed to the metaphysician, who he claims is the one who puts forth a theory and a vocabulary that applies to all instances and is frozen in time, explaining everything from which one can derive what the truth is, capital T. That's what the metaphysician does.
Okay, but going with that though, aren't part of what he's saying? Don't part of what he's saying have to be frozen in time? Because if every, like, certain definitions or goals of justice, is he literally saying that over time every single definition in this theory could have its opposite meaning and it's still my theory? Like, you know what I'm getting at? Like, is there not something that he's grounding that's unchanging inside this, some of the understanding?
Well,
Or is every
sure.
single
Well, sure, but I mean, it's like the case of any kind of a word. All right, like we'll take the word liberal. All right, the word liberal has gone through many different definitions since it was first coined. What, in the 18th century, we'll say. Okay, a classical liberal, as they would like to call it. And then I remember, sort of during the 80s, is that liberal, and then going into the 90s, liberal was a derogatory term. Oh, you bleeding heart liberals type of stuff. Okay. So you didn't want to be tarred as a liberal. You wanted to be a conservative or something that was maybe a centrist. Okay, I'm talking about American politics here, not necessarily Canadian, but I guess you could say it's North American in general. But my point is that with any word, there is sort of a fixity to a word. Okay, but it's not fixity for all time. That's where the difference comes in. So yes, one could criticize Rorty and saying that, all right, so he's saying X, Y, and Z, but doesn't always, it's kind of the self-referential problem always. Well, he's explaining this theory or this narrative. Doesn't it apply to him? Well, of course it would apply to him. And it's kind of inescapable that you would do so. Also remember that in the introduction, he is a couple different times saying, in my liberal utopia. Okay, he begins paragraphs. But what's a utopia? Literally, utopia is a place that doesn't exist. So he's not really putting forward, I mean, he's certainly not a politician putting forth any kind of a policy, but he is reacting against metaphysicians, and it's part of his general project that he began starting from Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature in the 70s, criticizing the epistemological representationalist approach to things, which in his estimation had been the case in Western philosophy going back some centuries. One could say all the way back to Plato, but definitely starting with Descartes in the modern period. Okay. That makes sense, Shane?
It does. I mean, that's very clearly what he's trying to do. I guess my question, and I won't ask it again if it's getting pedantic, but do you think he thinks he's transcended being a metaphysicist in every regard? Because that's
no,
kind of
I don't
the
think.
question.
No, I don't.
Okay.
No, I don't think that. I don't think that.
Okay. So he would probably concede that he's having these minimal set of metaphysical claims or a priori things that will be more alive and organic and evolving than the classic metaphysics, let's say, would allow for in their more strictly defined system. But he would still concede, I'm going to have some grounding, but it's going to be a much more evolving, linguistically defined, communally defined, ongoing, innovative kind of way of looking at these things.
Well, that's
but still having some metaphysics at the beginning.
Well, I wouldn't say he has a metaphysics. You got to be careful when you use the term metaphysics, because as I was explaining to Andrew before you came on board, is that, you know, metaphysics can be defined in many different ways too. Me personally, I don't think that anybody can really escape from metaphysics. Okay. But is it metaphysics in the sense of like Aristotelian metaphysics or Platonic metaphysics or, you know, latter-day metaphysics? You know, there's been a lot more papers and books that have come out in the past 20 years on metaphysics than there was in the past. Okay. So people are still talking about metaphysics, but he has a very specific definition of what a metaphysician is. Somebody who comes up with a theory that is true for all time and that has one vocabulary that never changes, that explains everything. I'd say that's a nice summation of what he calls a metaphysician, and he is reacting against that.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense then. Okay. That's a nice way to maintain the tension. Okay, that definitely suits me for now, for sure. Thank you.
Okay, so that's a liberal, somebody who thinks that cruelty is the worst thing we do. And the ironist, this name of a person who faces up to the contingency of his or her own most central beliefs and desires. Someone sufficiently historicist and nominalist who have abandoned the idea that those central beliefs and desires refer back to something beyond the reach of time and chance. Okay? So one who is aware that the language that I use is contingent. No, I was born an American, you guys were born Canadians, we were born English speakers. Okay, that is a contingency. We were born in a Western democracy, Anglo-American democracy. That too is a contingency. So then the caution is not to take this as universal. That maybe for a time it applied to a wider range than it does now. And that maybe it's contracting, especially given what's happened in the past 10 to 20 years. And being aware that these things change over time and it's not fixed. Somebody who's aware of that in his definition is an ironist.
Right.
Okay.
I'm an ironist then.
Yes. So in the next paragraph, he continues. He says, for liberal ironists, there is no answer to the question, why not be cruel? No non-circular theoretical backup for the belief that cruelty is horrible. Nor is there an answer to the question, how do you decide when to struggle against injustice and when to devote yourself to private projects of self-creation? This question strikes liberal ironists just as hopeless as the questions, is it right to deliver n innocents over to be tortured to save the lives of m times n other innocents? If so, what are the correct values of n and m? Or the question, when may one favor members of one's family or one's community over other randomly chosen human beings? Anybody who thinks that there are well-grounded theoretical answers to this sort of question, algorithms for resolving moral dilemmas of this sort, is still in his heart a theologian or a metaphysician. He believes in an order beyond time and change, which both determines the point of human existence and establishes a hierarchy of responsibilities. Okay.
See, I just want to quickly say I find that really interesting, because that criticism to me is the exact same criticism that Jesus leveled against the Pharisaical Jews, who were worshiping their created law, or you could say, or the metaphysicist worshiping his created system, rather than the only thing that actually transcends that, which is, you know, God or the logos or the word or the spirit of something, right? And that can never be substantiated in any concrete formula. And that's kind of interesting that was literally the exact study thing I was doing before this, was that exact idea that the garment or the way you describe something, even the Bible is in this category, it's supposed to be pointing at something larger than itself and can't be reduced to the letters or the instantiations you currently have. So you wouldn't be able to answer those moral questions for all time by definition. Because there just isn't that's not the meaning that would derive the meaning or values you would use to answer those questions is always going to be in flux given the situation. So
right, and you highlight an interesting point about ethical or moral theories. Okay, so ethical or moral theories can get very sticky because they don't apply in every situation. You might do some pretty detailed mental gymnastics to try to justify why X is preferable over Y. But how would you do that in a non-circular way? And what are you appealing to ground your own theory? Okay. For example, one of, we could say, the enemies that Rorty has is Kant. Kantian moral theory is based on rationality, particularly the categorical imperative. Act as if it were a universal law. Okay, universal law derived from reason. Okay, that's Kantianism, broadly defined as kind of a target, along with Platonism. What is Platonism? Things that transcend beyond time and space, beyond history, blah, 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 abstract objects, and so on. So there's Platonism, there's Kantianism. These are just convenient labels for a philosophy that is like that. Okay, convenient labels, we'll say. Even though, yes, you can really get down to the nitty-gritty. Well, Plato didn't really say that, all right? So in general, this is what Platonism says. This is what Kantianism says. So Rorty was moving away from both of those.
Right.
And then the term about a liberal ironist. Okay, so you notice that what he's getting at in the introduction, and also what I said, Shane, to Andrew before you popped on, is that in his later essays, he uses the terms social hope and cultural politics more so than he does philosophy. Because in his mind, and what he's moving away from, is philosophy as metaphysics providing the timeless, the perennial, absolute foundations from which one may operate in the world and from which one may spin lots of different theories. A narrative is different from a theory. What is a narrative? A narrative tells a story, and the story changes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So he continues in the next paragraph. The ironist intellectuals who do not believe that there is such an order are far outnumbered, even in the lucky, rich, literate democracies, by people who believe that there must be one. Most non-intellectuals are still committed either to some form of religious faith or to some form of Enlightenment rationalism. So ironism has often seemed intrinsically hostile not only to democracy, but to human solidarity, to solidarity with the mass of mankind, all those people who are convinced that such an order must exist. But it is not. Hostility to a particular historically conditioned and possibly transient form of solidarity is not hostility to solidarity as such. One of my aims in this book is to suggest the possibility of a liberal utopia, one in which ironism, in the relevant sense, is universal. Okay. And I need to find the right page. Okay. He continues, a post-metaphysical culture seems to me no more impossible than a post-religious one, and equally desirable. In my utopia, human solidarity would be seen not as a fact to be recognized by clearing away, quote, prejudice, or burrowing down to previously hidden depths, but rather as a goal to be achieved. It is to be achieved not by inquiry, but imagine. Oh, I already read this one. Sorry. Well, this introduction is messed up. So I think we'll just end it there.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember you reading that last section before Shane got on here.
Yeah, I should have checked this most. All right. So I think that's enough of the introduction. So
Okay.
just to give a recap, what he's trying to do is showing up the three themes: contingency, irony, and solidarity. Solidarity is the goal in the end. Okay. But also highlighting that the three things, which we'll get to in a minute, that there's contingency involved and that there's irony involved. And what is the ironist? The ironist is someone who is aware that what he or she is operating with is contingent, is changing, and really has no unchanging foundations for it. That's what the ironist is. Because really, what is irony? And we defined irony earlier on. But in this context, the irony is operating at the opposite, you could say. I act as if these are solid beliefs that I have, but I know deep down inside that they're not, because I can't really, in all honesty, provide an unshakable and ironclad justification for them.
Yeah, definitely.
But wait, isn't solidarity as such solid, even if you can't articulate that it's solid?
But what is solidarity? How do you define solidarity?
That's not necessarily relevant. I'm just talking about, you could put any word in there for solidarity. I would think, you could put the kingdom of heaven as in there for his phrase. You could put a lot of different phrases in there, but is he not trying to say that that's in his utopia, that's going to be that is the goal, is going to be solid, even if the definition of it might change or we can't fully articulate it? Is he not saying that that is a solid thing, or as such?
I think you might be misunderstanding what solidarity is.
Isn't it just some string of words that's going to point towards a goal or state of being that he wants to see in the world?
No. Andrew, what was the definition of solidarity we came up with earlier?
Like the one that I said was sort of like a sense of loyalty and community among people with shared values and interests and goals, like people like a sports team or people who go to the same church, for example.
Yeah, and there's a strong psychological component to it.
Yeah.
So that's a good general definition of what solidarity is.
Yeah, and that's just defining a goal and a way of operationalizing it. Is it
So
not?
how is that solid if it's going to change based on the group that we're talking about?
Well, because the goal and the specific exact way it's manifested is going to change. So the worldly aspect of it's going to change, but the spiritual or meaning aspect of it, the part that you can never fully represent by words, that part's not going to change, even if our understanding of it does, because it's always going to be because it's always going to be solidarity as such that we're going after. We just are going to keep stumbling upon what that looks like.
But if you're always going after it, that doesn't necessarily mean that you actually do reach it, even if that's the goal.
Right, that's the good point, because when he talks about earlier on in the introduction, and we'll see this later in the later essays too, about descriptions and redescriptions, okay, you can't ever pin down really any of these terms. So again, in his liberal utopia, remember that it's a utopia, that he is moving towards solidarity. Solidarity, even though he doesn't mention this, but we could bring this in here too, in contradistinction to something like tribal unity or to national unity. And we mean like ethno-national unity, where there is something that binds the people together, such as something like blood. Okay. That's a different sense of what solidarity is, because in solidarity, you could have lots of different people. And in fact, this is what the premise of North American liberal democracies were supposed to be, is that you could take a whole bunch of different people. They have a sense of community. They have a sense of shared goals and values that would carry them forward, even though they might be of different races, they might be of different ethnic backgrounds, and so on. So the solidarity kind of transcends that. But now, as we're seeing, that's, in my estimation, probably is not going to get better. in the decades ahead is that solidarity is breaking down. It's changing. Okay. Now, there might be new solidarities that emerge versus what came before in previous decades. But the fact that there is that solidarity among disparate types of people, diverse types of people, is what he's pushing towards. Does that make sense? What his goal is.
Yeah, so the fact that you're always seeking after, and there always will be a changing solidarity. That's the solid part. That part
Right.
doesn't change.
That's never that it's right. The descriptions and the redescriptions, as you mentioned earlier, that doesn't change. It's going to continue on and on and on. They're never going to arrive at a fixed point. That's what the metaphysician would say, but not the liberal ironist.
But isn't
Right.
his utopia always going to be seeking after solidarity?
Yes, that's what one of his goals is.
Yeah, so that part is solid. That doesn't
Yes.
change.
It's solid.
Okay.
It doesn't change. Okay.
Okay.
All right. All right. Let's see if I got. Yes. Okay. We got the right pages. Okay. So that's the end of the introduction. So let's go ahead to contingency itself. All right. The first essay. This is chapter 1, the contingency of language, on page 3. So let's see. I will not read the whole thing. I have my highlighted points here. Okay. So on page 4 at the bottom, he says, we need to make a distinction between the claim that the world is out there and the claim that truth is out there. To say that the world is out there, that it is not our creation, is to say, with common sense, that most things in space and time are the effects of causes which do not include human mental states. To say that truth is not out there is simply to say that where there are no sentences, there is no truth. That sentences are elements of human languages, and that human languages are human creations. Truth cannot be out there, cannot exist independently of the human mind, because sentences cannot so exist or be out there. The world is out there, but descriptions of the world are not. Only descriptions of the world can be true or false. The world on its own, unaided by the describing activities of human beings, cannot. Continuing, the suggestion that truth, as well as the world, is out there is a legacy of an age in which the world was seen as the creation of a being who had a language of his own. If we cease to attempt to make sense of the idea of such a non-human language, we shall not be tempted to confuse the platitude that the world may cause us to be justified in believing a sentence true with the claim that the world splits itself up on its own initiative into sentence-shaped chunks called facts. But if one clings to the notion of self-subsistence facts, it is easy to start capitalizing the word truth and treating it as something identical either with God or with the world as God's project. Then one will say, for example, that truth is great and will prevail. This conflation is facilitated by confining attention to single sentences as opposed to vocabularies. For we often let the world decide the competition between alternative sentences. For example, between red wins and black wins, or between the butler did it and the doctor did it. In such cases, it is easy to run together the fact that the world contains the causes of our being, justified in holding a belief, with the claim that some non-linguistic state of the world is itself an example of truth, or that some such state makes a belief true by corresponding to it. But it is not so easy when we turn from individual sentences to vocabularies as wholes. Okay, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, I like that. It kind of goes back to his criticism of the representationalist theory of truth.
And the correspondence theory.
And the correspondence theory of truth, yeah.
Okay. So one of the key points here is he talks about sentences. Okay. So sentences, first of all, do not exist apart from human beings because language is a creation of human beings. And number two, sentences are what are true or false. Actually, you could say propositions, but propositions are contained within sentences. But vocabularies are not true or false.
Right.
Okay. Would you agree with that?
I don't know. I guess I would say something more like those vocabularies work, not necessarily that they're true. Maybe they're contingently true depending on what type of vocabulary you're using, but those are always going to change throughout history too.
Okay. Well, let me stop you there. Let's back up a minute. You said vocabularies work. Now, what does that sound like?
A pragmatist theory of language.
A pragmatist view, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Shane, what do you think?
Well, I have issue with him separating the world as such from human creation as such, because like he's drawing this neat line from, okay, there's the world out there, it's not true or false. I'm going to say humans are not part of that world in some way. So it's I think that's where his logic, and he needs this to be true for his ultimate thing where you're only going to focus on language to work. So I don't know. It all really hinges on somehow there being that hard line between human descriptions of the world and the world.
Is that really what he's
And
saying?
because going on, he will say, well, the reason we would say it's true is because it corresponds, or the reason we would say it's true is because it represents the real world. You're still maintaining that division. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I would say it's true because it's part of the world. I use a word like resonate or reflects the world, you know?
That's like what he talks about in philosophy in the Mirror of Nature and the representationalist theory of truth.
The representationalist theory of mind, the
Correspondence theory of truth. I keep getting those mixed up.
Yeah. Well, the correspondence theory is kind of commonsensical. You know, when you ask the person in the street, you point to, you have an apple and you pointed to it and you say, is this apple red? Yes or no? And the person would say yes or no. Okay. Does my statement correspond to what the object is? Does it contain that color? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty commonsensical. So, but again, his point is that sentences are what are true or false, and languages are human creations. Now, yes, I would concede with Shane's point is that, yes, in order for this to work, you draw a line distinct, is that the human being is distinct from the world. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
you could credibly say, yes, the human being is part of the world. But now we're starting to get into the question of, well, what is the world? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also, that's a good point too.
And how does the world come about if not through descriptions, language?
Yeah. And also, like,
or an observer.
I think people being part of the world, that doesn't necessarily mean that anything is true.
Because we're going back to definitions here. What kind of a world are we talking about? Are we talking about the physical world, the spiritual world, the fictitious world that a novel would encapsulate? You know,
Mm-hmm.
and the thing about he also mentioned this earlier on, Shane, in the introduction, about how novels, docudramas, TV shows, what have you, are into the narrative. Okay, and the narrative, you could even say too, it takes up the vocabulary. Now, with the vocabulary, we all speak English, so we have a large vocabulary, being educated people that we are, and we could do lots of different things with the English vocabulary that we know, and maybe to a certain extent Spanish or French or German or whatever other languages we might have a smattering of, to describe what the world is. But we can describe the world without it even corresponding to it necessarily. So one wonders about, and this is his point, one wonders about the truthiness of a vocabulary versus a sentence. Now, philosophers, I'm still running with this, is that philosophers are preoccupied with the sentence. Is the sentence true or false? Does it correspond to reality? Does it correspond to the world?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a description, a vocabulary, might not be true or false. Maybe it's somewhere in the middle or neither one of those. It's just a way of, and this is in the pragmatist vein, you're using the vocabulary to describe the world, whatever the world happens to be, as a way to move through it and get what you need to do, get done with what you need to get done within the world. It's a little bit of a tangent I went off in there, but
Yeah.
Well,
It's
I mean,
useful.
this is where I see the overlap between, pragmatism and my understanding of one of the key differences from Eastern and Western Christianity, where in pragmatism it's like it's true if it works. Now, what he's going to change the word true and what's the word he likes to use instead? It's not true. It's he says he wants to get rid of true. He wants a word like it's like accurate or fit for purpose or something. He switches at some point. He wants to do
well, that sounds
an
more.
interview. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say in the interview, he said, I don't think we should be even concerned about truth. We just want to have something else instead. I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, I can't remember the word either, but yeah, he does make that point.
Yeah, truth with a capital T.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So either way, though, I do think that whether you use pragmatist language and say, okay, well, your representational schemes are not actually going to give you truth. You're just going to have whatever that word is to describe things working, whereas a Christian would say, you're never going to have truth in terms of anything you create. It's either going to lead you to salvation or continuance. You get, or the pragmatist would say it continues to work. The Christian would say it saves you, or you continue to exist. So what you're doing, whether it's your vocabulary or your society or whatever, it either continues, either leads towards salvation, or it's not true.
Right.
So to me, I see that as the overlap, because you're not grounding your truth in your created definition of it. You're grounding it in something that's kind of transitory and transcendent at the same time.
Right. Or there's not a correspondence there. The correspondence theory, which is again a kind of a commonsensical view, but there's a whole host of problems that are not working with the correspondence theory of truth. And there's other theories of truth too, which is a separate subject. We're not going to get into that here.
Right.
But one could say, and I see the overlap, Shane, quite clearly, is that using the vocabulary, something more holistic instead of sentences, which one can argue whether they're true or false or not. The vocabulary serves a purpose. Does it describe the world accurately so you can operate in it? Does it lead the society forward towards salvation, as the Christian would hold it? Or does it serve some other purpose? Many other purposes that you can have with a vocabulary.
Yeah, so the global truth of a vocabulary would be hard to state, right? But
right.
even technically, I think any even sophisticated statement can't be globally true. Whether it's the problem you said earlier, where in the details manifesting it, you're going to run into all sorts of quagmires, or it's going to be 80% effective even by its own definition, right? So is now truth on a continuum? I don't think it's. I think whether you're a pragmatist or a non-materialist, you're not going to want to have such clear-cut 0 or 1 truth definitions. That are usually you can only achieve anyways with a kind of a reductionist point of view in the first place. So
right, yeah,
for sure.
There are problems with a reductionist, or one could say even a materialist, 100% materialist view.
Yeah,
there are problems with that.
Yeah.
But anyways, continuing, let's go to page 6. So Rorty continues: the world does not speak, only we do. The world can, once we have programmed ourselves with a language, cause us to hold beliefs. But it cannot propose a language for us to speak. Only other human beings can do that. The realization that the world does not tell us what language games to play should not, however, lead us to say that a decision about which to play is arbitrary, nor to say that it is the expression of something deep within us. The moral is not that objective criteria for choice of vocabulary are to be replaced with subjective criteria, reason with will or feeling. It is rather that the notions of criteria and choice, including that of arbitrary choice, are no longer in point when it comes to changes from one language game to another. So to put it another way, it doesn't matter where the language comes from. Actually, let me back up a minute. So his first point is that the language does not emerge from the world. It comes from other human beings. This is how we learn language, by the way. So we come into possession of a vocabulary which we use to describe the world to ourselves and to other human beings. Now, his later point, and we'd seen this too in Consequences and Pragmatism, to answer the charges that pragmatism is subjective, which it's not, in his estimation. It's not irrational. And those kinds of things, which kind of a metaphysician or someone of that ilk would charge him as. Well, if you're saying it's not objective, for example, then it has to be subjective. Okay, well, that's an either or, and he's moving away from that. His last sentence, it is rather that the notions of criteria and choice are no longer in point when it comes to changes from one language game to another. Okay, so it doesn't matter. Then later on he says, Europe did not decide to accept the idiom of romantic poetry, or of socialist politics, or of Galilean mechanics. That sort of shift was no more an act of will than it was a result of argument. Rather, Europe gradually lost the habit of using certain words and gradually acquired the habit of using others. So instead of a clean break, there was a gradual change from what the vocabulary had described previously to what the vocabulary then came to describe later on. And that it continued going into the 20th century, now into the 21st century, and still running with the same argument will continue for as long as humans use language. How we describe things now are definitely not going to be the same 200 years from now. Maybe there's some remnants there, but it will not be the same.
Right.
Questions, comments?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I totally agree. What do you think, Shane?
Again, he's still maintaining that clean distinction between human creation and other creation, right? Because when he says only humans speak, it's like that he's saying there's no causal chain between reality informing the language. Like he seems to be implying it's just from the human mind. And that's the same distinction I had an issue with earlier, so we can talk more about that if you want. And then the second one, too, is he's also presupposing there's no underlying will guiding any of these actions. That he's presupposing an agency-less world to a certain extent.
Yes, it's contingency.
Yeah, he's saying everything's contingency. So he's presupposing there's no revelation, there's no grand purpose. He's presupposing all those things. So, that's a much larger discussion.
As opposed to presupposing that there are these things.
Well, they're both presuppositions.
Yeah.
So
right. Rorty takes the contingent track, the ironist track, and the nominalist track, and he says so in the introduction.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what's a nominalist? The word doesn't point to something beyond it. That's against Platonism.
Well, it's also against Eastern Christianity, which itself is against Platonism.
Right. So the word in and of itself does not point to something that's beyond it. That's really what a nominalist is.
So I don't necessarily need to rehash why being a nominalist is good or bad. It's just this flagging it is a presupposition,
right?
And I'm pretty sure he's taking it up.
Yeah. So long as we're clear where he's coming from with this, he made no bones about it. Okay, he's not being sly about these things. Okay. So let's go to page 6, bottom. He says, the temptation to look for criteria is a species of the more general temptation to think of the world or the human self as possessing an intrinsic nature and essence. That is, it is the result of the temptation to privilege some one among the many languages in which we habitually describe the world or ourselves. As long as we think that there is some relation called fitting the world, or expressing the real nature of the self, which can be possessed or lacked by vocabularies as wholes, we shall continue the traditional philosophical search for a criterion to tell us which vocabularies have this desirable future. But if we could ever become reconciled to the idea that most of reality is indifferent to our descriptions of it, and that the human self is created by the use of a vocabulary, rather than being adequately or inadequately expressed in a vocabulary, then we should at last have assimilated what was true and the romantic idea that truth is made rather than found. What is true about this claim is just that languages are made rather than found, and that truth is a property of linguistic entities, of sentences.
Truth is linguistically contingent.
Yes. Truth is, rather than true, okay, the romantic idea that truth is made rather than found, but that languages are made rather than found.
Mm-hmm.
One doesn't discover English. English was made and it evolved.
Yeah.
For example, just as the other languages are. Now, one could make a, well, no, even Esperanto was made. Esperanto is one of the handful of artificial languages created in the 20th century, deliberately. But also Esperanto was created from taking bits and pieces from the other Romance languages.
Right. Like, well, all languages, especially English, are kind of bastardized combinations of others.
Yes, English is a bastardized language, but some other languages not so much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, like maybe some of the Chinese languages, for example, like Mandarin and Cantonese.
Right. Okay, so his point again is that there is no unchanging essential human self. Okay, an intrinsic nature or an essence. That's one thing there. And then the next essay, he talks about the contingency of selfhood. But right now we're on language. So language is something contingent. It is made, and truth is, by extension, made in this. But truth is a property of linguistic essences of sentences, not of vocabularies. I'm going to restate that point. Okay, then on page 8, he continues, to say that there is no such thing as intrinsic nature is not to say that the intrinsic nature of reality has turned out, surprisingly enough, to be extrinsic. It is to say that the term intrinsic nature is one which it would pay us not to use, an expression which has caused more trouble than it has been worth. To say that we should drop the idea of truth as out there, waiting to be discovered, is not to say that we have discovered that out there is no truth. It is to say that our purposes would be served best by ceasing to see truth as a deep matter, as a topic of philosophical interest, or true as a term which repays analysis. The nature of truth is an unprofitable topic, resembling in this respect the nature of man and the nature of God, and differing from the nature of the positron and the nature of Oedipal fixation. But this claim about relative profitability, in turn, is just the recommendation that we can in fact say little about these topics and see how we get on.
Right.
Okay. So what he's getting at here, which I had mentioned before, is that rather than tear our hair out over what are we trying to define here, let's not even bother ourselves with it, really. Because
Right.
in the end is not particularly important. Because, and do this as an extension, you ask the average person in the street, they're not thinking about what a theory of truth is.
Right.
It's just kind of commonsensical that, well, whatever I say, or whatever Trump happens to say in the news is true or false. That's where it really gets interesting.
Yeah.
What any politician has to say is true or false. Okay, well, to say it's true or false in that context is more like it matters to them in some respect. But is it really what a philosopher would care about in terms of a theory of truth? No. And the average person is not really concerned with the theory of truth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So he continues, on the view of philosophy which I am offering, philosophers should not be asked for arguments against, for example, the correspondence theory of truth or the idea of the, quote, intrinsic nature of reality. The trouble with arguments against the use of a familiar and time-honored vocabulary is that they are expected to be phrased in that very vocabulary. Okay, so there's no meta language here that you can criticize the theory,
Right.
because you're using the very vocabulary in which that theory is expressed.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
There's no universal way to criticize it.
Right. No non-circular way to criticize it.
Yes.
Yes. Now, there is the field of metaphilosophy where you're trying to define the methods of philosophy that it works, but you're still using what that language is.
Right.
Okay. Then there have been attempts by philosophers in the past to try to come up with some kind of a language to, well, first of all, they would say that mathematics is a quote pure language to describe such things. But then you had other philosophers saying that mathematics could really be just reduced to logic. Okay. Mathematics is an expression of logic. Mathematics
It sounds like what positivists would say.
Yes, sounds like what positivists would say. Exactly. Shane, you got any questions or comments so far?
I think this is his first revealed truth and commandment he's laying out there. He's spreading the good word that you can have faith and there's no essences, and I have faith and that's the best thing that's going to save us. It's better for humanity. So these seem to be more. He's saying a lot of philosophical and practical things I agree with, but at its heart, I think he's making like a very deep theological claim about the nature of reality, and he's asking you to have faith in it. And then
I'm not sure he's going that far with his pragmatist view on things.
Well, I see where Shane's getting at this. So remember what I had said before, that me personally, you really can't escape metaphysics. You might say that you're not a metaphysician, but you do have some kind of a commitment to a way of seeing things versus what somebody else might.
That sounds like a worldview.
A worldview, or you could even use Quine's term as an ontological commitment. That's a useful term to use too, that you're committed to the existence of certain entities versus others. Like I could say, I believe in the existence of pink elephants. That's an ontological commitment. Or, theologically speaking, is I'm committed to the existence of certain supernatural things. Mm-hmm. Supreme being, angels, lesser deities, demons, whatever happens may be. That's an ontological commitment. I believe in that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Okay.
So next page 9, he continues saying, the latter method of philosophy is the same as the method of utopian politics or of revolutionary science, as opposed to parliamentary politics or no more science. The method is to redescribe lots and lots of things in new ways, until you have created a pattern of linguistic behavior which will tempt the rising generation to adopt it, thereby causing them to look for appropriate new forms of non-linguistic behavior. For example, the adoption of new scientific equipment or new social institutions. This sort of philosophy does not work piece by piece, analyzing concept after concept or testing thesis after thesis. Rather, it works holistically and pragmatically. It says things like, try thinking of it this way, or more specifically, try to ignore the apparently futile traditional questions by substituting the following new and possibly interesting questions. It does not pretend to have a better candidate for doing the same old things, which we did when we spoke in the old way. Rather, it suggests that we might want to stop doing those things and do something else. But it does not argue for this suggestion on the basis of antecedent criteria, common to the old and the new language games. For just insofar as the new language really is new, there will be no such criteria.
Okay.
Okay. Let me reread the one sentence. The method is to redescribe sorry. The method is to redescribe lots and lots of things in new ways until you have created a pattern of linguistic behavior which will tempt the rising generation to adopt it, thereby causing them to look for appropriate new forms of non-linguistic behavior. For example, the adoption of new scientific equipment or new social institutions. Now, what I wanted to highlight with this sentence is, look at what happened with the rise of smartphones and social media. Okay. Technology is involved here, but, patterns of linguistic behavior, tweets, posts, likes, dislikes, it's kind of linguistic behavior, and then causing them to adopt new forms of non-linguistic behavior. Okay. So the point he's getting at here is, you're introducing this vocabulary to the younger generation. They can adopt it whole. They usually do not adopt it wholesale. They adopt probably a good portion of it, along with some neologisms, new ways of thinking of things, and then mixing it with that. Or they might reject whole portions of it outright and instead substitute for something else. Okay. He doesn't mention technology here, but technology definitely is a factor in how things are expressed. What is the linguistic behavior and the non-linguistic behavior in this early part of the 21st century? Even starting in the aughts, after the millennium, particularly with the introduction of smartphone and social media.
Mm-hmm.
You see the benefits that arise from that, but also the detriments that have arose from that. But that's what the point of that is here, is not that there's one method he's saying about the method, the same as the method of utopian politics or revolutionary science, but the method is redescription. Okay. It doesn't work piece by piece, conceptual analysis. It's just something, as he says, holistically and pragmatically. Here it is in total. Try it this way. Maybe not do this anymore. Try it many different ways, things like this. It's just more of evolutionary, holistically.
Right.
Okay. Questions or comments on that?
No, that makes sense. What about you, Shane?
I think I'm gonna leave it for now. Let him say more.
Okay. Let's see here. Okay, he has some things to say about Davison here. Might be too much. Okay, just give me a minute here.
What you were just doing another podcast before this, Shane?
I'm doing a I found this one theological paper that finally, and with the virus thing too, that finally motivated me to set up a chat around it.
Okay.
So maybe eventually, if I could find, like, Tim's been good at finding sources to go through, and if I could find something like that on an ongoing basis, maybe I would try to do that around some of the theological themes I'm interested in. So I'm just kind of getting my feet wet on organizing them and seeing what it'll take, because it's not everybody who's suited to kind of do the kind of give and take that lets you flow through these things, So it really
Okay.
depends on exactly what you're trying to achieve. So I'm kind of experimenting with that. And then I have another friend who is doing a philosophy undergrad, very smart guy. He wants to do like start doing a great books of Western civilization oriented thing, but maybe have he has this program called Notion that you can download, I think, for free. It allows you to like share notes and annotations on PDFs, and I think it links to some other functionality. But basically, you could imagine you could kind of different people could review the same work. You could see other people's notes, so you can kind of interact while reading, so to speak. Have your own notes, have other notes, and then hopefully have that eventually culminate in a group meeting, and you kind of get a hybrid way of doing a course or learning a material that's kind of has some direction but also is cooperative. So those are a couple of the ideas that are floating around.
Is that notion.so?
I think so.
Yes.
Maybe it is.
And
That's awesome.
yes, if Shane is mentioning the virus, he's trying to have it go viral. Haha.
Let it spread like coronavirus.
That's right. All right. So I found another paragraph here on page 12. So Rorty says, the gradual trial and error creation of a new third vocabulary, the sort of vocabulary developed by people like Galileo, Hegel, or the later Yeats, William Butler Yeats, the poet, is not a discovery about how old vocabularies fit together. That is why it cannot be reached by an inferential process, by starting with premises formulated in the old vocabularies. Such creations are not the result of successfully fitting together pieces of a puzzle. They are not discoveries of a reality behind the appearances, of an undistorted view of the whole picture with which to replace myopic views of its parts. The proper analogy is with the invention of new tools to take the place of old tools. To come up with such a vocabulary is more like discarding the lever and the chalk because one has envisaged the pulley, or like discarding gesso and tempera because one has now figured out how to size canvas properly. This Wittgensteinian analogy between vocabularies and tools has one obvious drawback. The craftsman typically knows what job he needs to do before picking or inventing tools with which to do it. By contrast, someone like Galileo, Yeats, or Hegel, a poet in my wide sense of the term, the sense of one who makes things new, is typically unable to make clear exactly what it is that he wants to do before developing the language in which he succeeds in doing it. His new vocabulary makes possible, for the first time, a formulation of its own purpose. It is a tool for doing something which could not have been envisaged prior to the development of a particular set of descriptions, those which it itself helps to provide. But I shall for the moment ignore this disanalogy. I want simply to remark that the contrast between the jigsaw puzzle and the tool models of alternative vocabularies reflects the contrast between, in Nietzsche's slightly misleading terms, the will to truth and the will to self-overcoming. Both are expressions of the contrast between the attempt to represent or express something that was already there and the attempt to make something that never had been dreamed of before. Okay? So, he brings up an interesting point, and it reminds me of certain philosophers who themselves had come up with new vocabularies. And, Andrew, this reminds me of, to a certain extent, Deleuze and Guattari. What is philosophy? What they had to say about that?
Yeah.
You know, the conceptual persona and all that?
I don't remember that specific part.
Well, with the conceptual persona, for example, Descartes, okay, what did Descartes come up with? The cogito.
Right.
Which itself is it's a form. It's the thinking thing, the thinking subject. Mm-hmm. And it's the shorthand that later philosophers, even up to this day, have used to denote, okay, it's the thinking thing. It is possibly, according to the philosopher, the essence of what the human being is. Mm-hmm. Could be something else, but maybe something that makes it distinct. You know, a man is a thinking thing versus an animal, as far as we could tell. But this new vocabulary, you know, in particular the poet, the one who makes things new, and also reminds me what Heidegger had to say about the poets, particularly Hölderlin, that poets were better than philosophers to a certain extent of describing, key term there, describing the world or one's experiences in the world versus a philosopher.
Right.
Okay. So let's see. Then a little bit later on page 14, he has to say about Davidson, because he has a very long description of what Davidson was up to. He says, Donald Davidson's account of linguistic communication dispenses with the picture of language as the third thing intervening between self and reality, and of different languages as barriers between persons or cultures. To say that one's previous language was inappropriate for dealing with some segment of the world, for example, the starry heavens above or the raging passions within, is just to say that one is now, having learned a new language, able to handle that segment more easily. To say that two communities have trouble getting along because the words they use are so hard to translate into each other is just to say that the linguistic behavior of inhabitants of one community may, like the rest of their behavior, be hard for inhabitants of the other community to predict. As Davidson puts it, and this is a quote from Davidson, quote, "We should realize that we have abandoned not only the ordinary notion of a language, but we have erased the boundary between knowing a language and knowing our way around the world generally. For there are no rules for arriving at passing theories that work. There is no more chance of regularizing or teaching this process than there is of regularizing or teaching the process of creating new theories to cope with new data. For that is what this process involves. There is no such thing as a language. Not if a language is anything like what philosophers at least have supposed. There is therefore no such thing to be learned or mastered. We must give up the idea of a clearly defined shared structure which language users master and then apply to cases. We should give up the attempt to illuminate how we communicate by appeal to conventions." End quote. Okay.
So we should give up like I think it's Wittgenstein's attempt in his earlier philosophy to arrive at like some final theory of language. And I think Kant talks about something like that too, does he?
About language?
Yeah, about the similar type of theory as Wittgenstein's first theory.
Well, with Kant, it was more about metaphysics. Okay, how is metaphysics as a science possible? I don't recall, because I haven't read all that much Kant, about what he had to say about language. But definitely with Wittgenstein, Wittgenstein, the earlier Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, was trying to come up with how is it that, sentences reflect states of affairs. That's one of the theses in the Tractatus. And the picture theory of language, okay, in essence. And then later on in the philosophical investigations, this is where the language games comes in. So the interesting thing about the earlier paragraph is to say that two communities have trouble getting along because the words they use are so hard to translate into each other is just to say that the linguistic behavior of inhabitants of one community may, like the rest of their behavior, be hard for inhabitants of the other community to predict. And then with the Davidson quote, "There is no such thing as a language, not if a language is anything like what philosophers at least have supposed. Nothing to be learned or mastered." Okay, so when we talk about this language, okay, we say that there's language, but there is no such thing as a language in the philosophical sense. How do we define what the language is? What are the atomistic components of what a language is? What's the theory of truth involved with the language? Davidson's like, no, we're done with that.
Yeah.
We're done with that. And Davidson is one of Rorty's heroes, intellectual heroes.
Right. Yeah, I like that too.
So he is very much influenced by, to a certain extent, Wittgenstein, and definitely to a large extent, by Davidson.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, he does talk about Wittgenstein's later theory of language games a lot, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Pressing on. So on page 16, he says, "To see the history of language, and thus of the arts, the sciences, and the moral sense, as the history of metaphor, is to drop the picture of the human mind, or human languages, becoming better and better suited to the purposes for which God or nature designed them. For example, able to express more and more meanings or to represent more and more facts. The idea that language has a purpose goes once the idea of language's medium goes. A culture which renounced both ideas would be the triumph of those tendencies in modern thought, which began 200 years ago. The tendencies common to German idealism, Romantic poetry, and utopian politics. And then on the next page, I could develop the contrast between the idea that the history of culture has a telos, such as the discovery of truth or the emancipation of humanity, and the Nietzschean and Davidsonian picture which I am sketching, by noting that the latter picture is compatible with a bleakly mechanical description of the relation between human beings and the rest of the universe. For genuine novelty can, after all, occur in a world of blind, contingent, mechanical forces. Think of novelty as the sort of thing which happens when, for example, a cosmic ray scrambles the atoms in a DNA molecule, thus sending things off in the direction of the orchids or the anthropoids. The orchids, when their time came, were no less novel or marvelous for the sheer contingency of this necessary condition of their existence. Analogously, for all we know, or should care, Aristotle's metaphorical use of ousia, St. Paul's metaphorical use of agape, and Newton's metaphorical use of gravitas were the results of cosmic rays scrambling the fine structure of some crucial neurons in their respective brains. Or, more plausibly, they were the result of some odd episodes in infancy, some obsessional kinks left in these brains by idiosyncratic traumata. It hardly matters how the trick was done. The results were marvelous. There had never been such things before.
What are the what do those words mean that you all said about different philosophers, like gravitas, and I forget what the other two were?
Well, gravitas is gravity.
Okay.
Okay, Newton.
Yeah.
Aristotle, ousia, which is substance, the essence of something. And St. Paul, agape, which is a certain kind of love. Not romantic love, but Christian love.
Okay.
We can unpack that better, but we'll just leave it for now. Okay?
Like love of God, or like the nuclear family idea of love, or?
Well, rather than... always have to look this one up.
I think it's going to end up being, it's that transcendent self-sacrificial love. So there's the love.
Yes, the highest form of love, charity, and the love of God for man and of man for God.
Which, funnily enough, is he just calls that solidarity. Rorty just calls it solidarity. He just doesn't bait and switch, as far as I can tell.
Religious solidarity.
Religious solidarity, yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I'm just taken with the fact that he's saying, okay, language is tools, so now they're always tools, so they always have a telos of being tools, or the goal of using these languages is going to be towards solidarity. So that's going to be the telos. I don't see how he escapes the telos. I keep stumbling on. I agree with what he says about not going just with your worldly definitions, but I think he overstates his case when he says, "Oh, I'm removing telos," or "I'm removing." Anyways, I don't know if that's interesting to hear.
Means he's just like, that's a goal based on like some form of attempt at an external analysis, and like in terms of what I said about religious solidarity, that there are different types of solidarity, and that's one of them.
Yeah. But doesn't every tool?
I don't think. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, but I don't think he says that he actually does escape telos.
Well, when he's talking about telos, is the discovery of truth and the emancipation of humanity. Two examples of a telos. The idea of the history of culture. Okay,
yeah.
This is what culture. This is what society has been moving towards. Okay. That's not what he's getting at. Rather, and in the paragraph, he is, not subtly expressing a sort of materialistic view, and definitely a contingent view, and that novelty is something that, spontaneously erupts. Okay. Okay, I could go for that, just as a lot of other people. Novelty doesn't necessarily have a purpose to it. Okay.
So he has contingent views just like everyone else does.
Sure, a contingent view. You know, if you ask the average person in the street, you could say, would you agree that something new, fresh, and never seen before could just emerge? Okay. Some people would say yes, other people would say no.
Right.
Okay. The people who would say no, maybe if they're religiously minded, they would say, well, God created it. Okay. All right. So it comes from some other source. And then a further subsection of that cohort would say, well, it was created for some purpose. And that's what a telos says.
Right.
Okay. But he's not getting to that. He's saying, yes, it is quite possible. In fact, he puts his weight behind it, is that, yes, these things emerged.
Right.
Okay. And remember that Rorty is an atheist.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, next paragraph. This account of intellectual history chimes with Nietzsche's definition of truth as a mobile army of metaphors. It also chimes with the description I offered earlier of people like Galileo and Hegel and Yeats, people in whose minds new vocabulary is developed, thereby equipping them with tools for doing things which could not even have been envisaged before these tools were available. But in order to accept this picture, we need to see the distinction between the literal and the metaphorical in the way Davidson sees it, not as a distinction between two sorts of meaning, nor as a distinction between two sorts of interpretation, but as a distinction between familiar and unfamiliar uses of noises and marks. The literal uses of noises and marks are the uses we can handle by our old theories about what people will say under various conditions. Their metaphorical use is the sort which makes us get busy developing a new theory. Okay.
Right.
So then skipping forward, page 21, he says, on the view I am suggesting, the claim that an adequate philosophical doctrine must make room for our intuitions is a reactionary slogan, one which begs the question at hand. For it is essential to my view that we have no prelinguistic consciousness to which language needs to be adequate, no deep sense of how things are, which it is the duty of philosophers to spell out in language. What is described from such a consciousness is simply a disposition to use the language of our ancestors, to worship the corpses of their metaphors. Unless we suffer from what Derrida calls Heideggerian nostalgia, we shall not think of our, quote, intuitions as more than platitudes, more than the habitual use of certain repertoire of terms, more than old tools which as yet have no replacements. And then to close out the essay, he continues, I can crudely sum up the story which historians like Hans Blumenberg tell by saying that once upon a time we felt a need to worship something which lay beyond the visible world. Beginning in the 17th century, we tried to substitute a love of truth for a love of God, creating the world described by science as a quasi-divinity. Beginning at the end of the 18th century, we tried to substitute a love of ourselves for a love of scientific truth, a worship of our own deep spiritual or poetic nature, treated as one more quasi-divinity. The line of thought common to Blumenberg, Nietzsche, Freud, and Davidson suggests that we try to get to the point where we no longer worship anything, where we treat nothing as a quasi-divinity, where we treat everything, our language, our conscience, our community, as a product of time and chance. To reach this point would be, in Freud's words, to, quote, treat chance as worthy of determining our fate. In the next chapter, I claim that Freud, Nietzsche, and Bloom do for our conscience what Wittgenstein and Davidson do for our language, namely exhibit its sheer contingency. The end.
Okay.
For that essay.
Coming back to contingency, of course.
Yes. So to sum up, the thing about contingency is no theory of language, really, no definition of language, taking Davidson's tack, at least the way philosophers want to define it. language is contingent. We inherit a language that came before us. We take the language, reshape it, modify it, send it on to the next generations who will do the same thing, on and on and on and on. But under no circumstances should we say that language sprung forth from one point in the past. People who are coming into the world are contingent in using that language. And no rules, well, you could say that there are rules, grammar, syntax, and so on, but that is referring to sentences rather than vocabularies, and the vocabularies are contingent in the way one describes the world using those.
Right.
That's really a good summation of that. But the main thing is that it's contingent, okay? Language didn't fall from the sky, didn't spring, cut from whole cloth, already well formed.
Right.
It's all about contingency.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And using those insights, moving away from being preoccupied with things like, well, what is the truth of this? What is the theory of truth? And so on and so forth. We don't need that. We do away with it while stressing the contingency of it. Chance worthy of our fate. Okay. If we're accepting that, then this can free us. And we'll also see this later on with selfhood, the contingency of selfhood, and then of community, is that it's not fixed. The good thing that we can derive from something that is contingent, or acknowledging that, I'm speaking a little bit more generally here, is that you don't suffer under the anxiety that it is fixed, that it is unchanging, that that's all that you can do with it. Rather, it opens up more possibilities of what you could do with it. And in this case, we've discussed language. Later on, we'll get to selfhood and community.
Right.
So that's what I think is a good summation of Rorty's points. Questions, comments? The floor is yours.
I like that. Well, yeah, it makes sense. I mean, what do you think? What do you think, Shane?
Well, I like it if he had presented it as a tool with benefits to conceive from this, to think from this point of view. I'd be 100% on board. It's just at the same time, he's also saying, because you can conceive this way and get these benefits that I want, because it's my utopia, I also am going to be like a high priest for a purposeless, meaningless view of the universe. He wants.
Every worldview is just as religious as yours.
Well, no, it's just no, but he says it quite transparently. He's saying, like, look, on the one hand, this is a more useful way to look at things, and he's making claims I think you seem to agree with about why it would be useful, how it solves certain problems, how it allows you to put your energy other places. So he says a lot of things, you could agree with on pragmatic ground, let's say. That's part interesting, but he also very clearly wants to go forward to say, we're also going to say everything's contingent. We're also going to say there isn't a telos. Like he's very clearly saying, I want you to use this on pragmatic grounds, and you need to be an atheist to do this. Like
no, he doesn't.
He's saying it.
He doesn't.
Well, he's saying
that.
you're not going to believe in anything outside of the language. It's not going to be. You're not going to work. There's no truth. There's no essences to things. He's basically enumerating all the key beliefs that underpin most religions or almost all traditional faiths, and saying you're not going to subscribe to any of those, and you're going to use my pragmatic tools over there.
Truth doesn't make you an atheist.
No, that's not what he's getting at. Rorty is an atheist.
Yeah.
He himself said that. So it is the not appealing to anything that is outside of the contingency.
Yeah.
So yes. So he's basically saying, if you were to adopt his paradigm, or whatever you want to call it, in a global sense, if it was going to be the underlying principle which we were to coordinate our action towards solidarity. Okay. Now, if you were to say this would be part of that solution, that would be one thing. But he's saying if we were to adopt this as our paradigm, it would exclude ever referencing anything outside of language, which he basically says as essence is, which is what God is in the Muslim understanding of God, the Christian understanding of God. He's precluding any of the presuppositions that you would base those belief systems on, and he's marrying that to adopting his worldview. He's not saying you can adopt this worldview part of the time. You know what I mean? He's actively espousing, I want you to get rid of any of the presuppositions that would allow you to have a traditional faith. And hey, my tool is good to use. He is saying both things. Unless I'm completely mishearing it, I'm pretty sure he is saying both things quite clearly.
I would also add is that when you're dealing with any kind of a philosophy, it is inescapable that that's the case, because when you state it, you're planting your stake in the ground, saying, "Here I am," or drawing the line in the sand. Here is my boundary of which I will not cross.
Mm-hmm.
They might not explicitly say that, but you can infer from that in what they say indirectly in another respects that
Shane
this is
always
what they're
likes to
getting
point
at.
out that everyone has an ideology.
I wouldn't say it's an ideology. I caution against using the term ideology. Everybody has a philosophy or a worldview, you could say.
Yeah,
I think that's a more charitable term for that. And Rorty, again, remember that, he says very early on, in my liberal utopia.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, part of his worldview is the importance of liberalism as well.
Right. Now, also, I wanted to draw more attention, because we'll see this later on once we get past the contingency essays, is about irony, being the liberal ironist.
Mm-hmm.
So the ironist is, I think maybe what Shane is getting at there is that the way Rorty is explaining things, at least so far, is that he's planting the stake in the ground, drawing the line in the sand, saying that this is me, this is my philosophy or my anti-philosophy, whatever word you want to use. But in the first essay, he is not doing what he did do in the introduction about what the ironist is. Now, if he were to say what he says, but also saying that I also acknowledges that everything that I have said is not solid, quote solid, and is not unassailable. Nobody can ever criticize me for what I say. It probably would lend him a little bit more credence. Is that fair, Shane? Am I getting to the number what your beef is with him?
Well, it's not so much the beef. It's just that I don't. I see. I guess my beef is that he almost feels like I can't accept what he's saying on pragmatic grounds, which I want to do. I see a lot of utility in what he's saying, but he's making it sound like I have to reject these other things I believe in too. Like they can't coexist. And he seems to be saying that. He's like, so I just find it interesting that I think what's going to happen as we go through it is I'm going to be like, oh, I see how this is a lot better than this older form of philosophy. I see it's a lot more useful, et cetera, et cetera. But then every once in a while, I'm going to be choking on the fact, and ergo, you should be an atheist, and ergo, it's just interesting that he would be preaching and philosophizing at the same time.
Well, come on, Shane. You got to admit that he's not as bad as Sam Harris on that ilk.
Yeah, I don't think he ever
he's
said
not.
so. You should be an atheist.
He's not saying that you should be an atheist, Andrew. He is.
Yeah.
He kind of makes clear that he is an atheist in the way he approaches these things.
I mean, I didn't even know he was an atheist until you said that, to be honest. Like, the way I read him, he doesn't sound like an atheist to me, but I guess I'm mostly used to reading like militant atheists like Sam Harris, although I have read Bertrand Russell's thoughts on religion recently too.
Oh, sure. You remember I told you elsewhere is that there have been many rather subtle and I'd say more intelligent atheists than Sam Harris and his ilk, or the militant atheists. I personally really don't have respect for militant atheists, is because what do? They're so wedded to stating one thing. You could even say is that atheism becomes a religion for them, that they have to proselytize everybody else. You could be an atheist without even mentioning to anybody that you're an atheist.
Yeah.
You could say flat out, I just don't accept the existence of a divine being.
Yep.
Okay. I'm an atheist.
Yep.
That's it. Okay. So
Rorty, much more so now.
Yeah. Yeah, so Rorty is an atheist. He made no secret of that. He's not a militant atheist about this. Also, remember that what he is getting at, going back to my summary that I said before, is with this book, he's fleshing out more of his, we could say, a mature philosophy, whereas before he was criticizing the predominant, in philosophy of mirror nature, the predominant analytic approach to things, which had its provenance going all the way back to Descartes with epistemology and the representationalist theory of mind. And then in Consequences of Pragmatism, really exploring more about what he was rediscovering in terms of pragmatism, particularly with an emphasis on doing. Then with Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, he is getting more on his own path where he sees things going to, and he's called a neo-pragmatist because he's not the classical pragmatist. He is taking pragmatic themes, using them to move in the direction of what he himself is, coming from a background of, first of all, he was raised in a communist family and a non-religious family. So there's already that. That's how he became an atheist, really, going back to his childhood.
Right.
And then pushing forward about the best things about a liberal democracy that one could do with a quasi-philosophical underpinning for it. But he is not the philosopher as is the analytic philosophers who spend all their time, what is our theory of truth? Let's analyze all these little problems. Let's see if we get the theories right. All the puzzle pieces are definitely placed. He was against that. He was moving away from that because that's what he had to deal with in the first phase of his academic career, even though temperamentally he was never that way.
And to his credit, I would say, like, he is actually constructing a process as well to get to his utopia. Like, something I find a little bit irksome with some form of atheists. It's like, okay, let's burn down this system and let's replace it with goals. And then you go, well, and then I always like, well, how are you going to get there? And Rorty's very clearly saying, okay, from first principles. I mean, yes, Shane takes some issues with some of those first principles, fair enough, but he is putting together a coherent, like, if you accept these suppositions I'm making, then I'm consistent from there on in. And this actually seems like it can operationalize in the world. And it seems like his theory can even take account of his own theory, which is always a really good thing. Often theories don't account for themselves, but he seems to kind of have that in there, if that makes any sense. So he's actually fleshing something out. So I'm not just being critical. So there is a strong pragmatic utility to what he's doing, and he's actually, again, that process part is really important. I think that's one thing he's getting at too with his definitions being in flux thing. Like, he's acknowledging that theories exist as a process, as a living thing that moves through time, right? And that's a key dynamic that I think this complexity science I'm into tries to get into. That I think a process oriented theories are, I think, a lot more powerful and better, even by representational standards or pragmatic standards, than ones that kind of have that built-in static nature to them that doesn't really allow them to really represent reality or be pragmatically valuable at all either. So
yeah. Okay, so that's all I got to say about this. We should save selfhood and maybe community for another time.
I just wanted to say too, I was just thinking the one difference between like the 90s specifically, as you mentioned before, and today is that I would think that the ironist is more likely to be conservative than liberal.
Yeah, but also remember what I'd said before about the definition of a liberal. How Jordan Peterson, among others, they describe themselves as a classical liberal. Well, the classical liberal stems back to Edmund Burke that time, which would be a conservative by several definitions today, versus the loony, off the deep end type of liberal, quote unquote liberal, we've been dealing with for the past several years.
Yeah. I mean, like you said, Edmund Burke, I often hear him referred to as a conservative.
Yeah, but he's a classical liberal. Also, even bringing in what we had covered with post-liberal theology in the POMO podcast, is that liberal theology was applying the Enlightenment strategies about reason and textual interpretation, hermeneutics, all that. That's the liberal tradition within theology. Okay. Really trying to understand what the text is telling you versus accepting the authority of the scripture in and of itself. Also based on prior authority that stretches back centuries, is that this is what the book is actually saying based on tradition, rather than you as the person reading it coming to your own conclusions, applying certain tools to get to what the meaning of the text might be.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's all I got. Any closing thoughts?
All right. Oh, that's pretty interesting. I like all his thoughts about basically the contingency of metaphysics, truth, and language, and having the goal of constructing this post-religious and post-metaphysical utopia. I kind of agree with both of you guys in that you can't necessarily escape the metaphysics, although, like you said, Tim, it depends on what you mean by metaphysics. But I think I like that goal, even though I don't think that a utopia is ultimately possible either. And like I said, I like the idea of the post-religious aspect, but obviously I don't think that that would be a good idea for all of society, because religion is clearly good for some people. But I like the whole, like, obviously pragmatic aspect of what he's trying to do, and what he's trying to focus on.
Just remember that utopias don't exist. Literally,
Yeah.
The word utopia means no place.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, take us out.
All right. Well, thanks again, as always, guys, for participating in this. Got more time now, of course. I think all of us do right now, at least a little bit anyway, because you don't have to go anywhere for the most part.
So we should be cranking these out over the next couple weeks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we could do another one soon, or I think we were gonna maybe do a postmodern theology one soon, because Max said he wanted to do one. I think usually weekends are best for him. We'll have to talk about that.
Well, let's try it this weekend if he's available then.
Yeah, we could maybe do that. Maybe Saturday, because we're doing the next Mixed Mental Arts chat on Sunday, right?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
And yeah, Dusty has to set up. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. Thanks, guys, and thanks everyone so much for watching another Mindgasms podcast. Hope you found this as educational and interesting as we did, I'm sure. And yeah, like I always say, thanks to those of you who subscribe to the channel, press the like button on the video, share it everywhere, comment on the video, and especially those of you who give me money on Patreon, which I really appreciate. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and also groove is in the heart. And stay safe from coronavirus, everyone. And you guys got any closing thoughts or any plugs you want to offer your social media or anything?
Andrew likes delight. Talk about contingency.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Anything to say for last words there, Shane?
Just a prayer that I have missed a couple nights, but we've been asking Jesus to have mercy on his world, and positive vibrations to everybody. And something that occurred to me today is I think that I don't know, I think being resolute and determined in this time, and remembering there's still a lot of blessings and a lot of solutions out there. So I hope nobody's despairing too much, because that's only going to make things worse. So
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, cool. All right, well, thanks, guys, and thanks again, everyone else, and adios until next time.
God bless. Good night, guys.